Please be aware that this episode discusses sensitive topics that some listeners may find distressing. If you or someone you know has been affected by any of these issues, please refer to the help and resources listed in the show notes for details of organisations that can provide support. Welcome to Mindful Merseyside, the podcast series which aims to improve everyone's physical and mental health in the Liverpool City region and beyond. This episode is called Healthy Muscle, Healthy Heart. Now, heart disease is the leading cause of death worldwide. In the UK, if somebody has a heart attack, they go to cardiac rehab, which is basically an aerobic exercise-based program to help reduce the risk of further cardiac events. Now, most research into heart health focuses on cardio as it immediately benefits the cardiovascular system. However, research also shows that people with more muscle and strength are less likely to develop heart disease and less likely to die if they do have a cardiac event. Now, in this episode, we talked about what happens to our muscle as we get older and what effect that has on our health. This is so interesting. And we also talk about what you can do to look after your muscle health as you get older. Now, this is specific. We're given examples of what exercises you can do, how you can help that with diet. So let's get into the episode. I'm joined by Richie Kerwin, lecturer in exercise physiology here at LJMU. Now, I'm going to start with the question I don't know if I want to know the answer to be completely honest. But that question is, what happens to our muscle as we get older?
Hey, Gemma. So I suppose one way that I like to kind of describe this to people is if you try and think back to your childhood, and if you think of some members of your family who might have been older, so like grandparent, for example, and if you imagine them over the course of years, how they might have changed. And I don't know about you, but I distinctly remember grandparents or older relatives getting a lot smaller and almost looking a lot frailer as they get older. And that is kind of an example of what happens to muscle as we age. So as we age, we start to experience something called sarcopenia. And it's a condition where we gradually, and in some cases not so gradually, lose muscle size, and to an even greater extent, we actually lose muscle strength as we get older. And it's a condition that it's relatively new in terms of it being recognized as something that you can actually diagnose. It's something that we all recognize. We all know that it happens. We see it all the time with relatives, like I just mentioned, but it only got an actual official diagnosis in 2016. And since then, there's been a lot more research into it because people are suddenly like, okay, we've got a name for it now. We can talk about it a lot more openly. And there's a lot more research into what it is, what it does, why it happens, and what we can do to prevent it. So some of my research focuses on that muscle loss that happens as we get older.
And would that be the same for everybody, regardless of, say, how fit they were to start with? If you had more muscle to start with, could you prevent that kind of more than if you didn't?
Yeah. So, and what you said there it's absolutely right. So as we lose muscle, people who have a higher, let's say, baseline level of muscle to start with, when they start losing it, they're obviously going to lose more muscle over time, but they'll never get to an extent of muscle loss, or it may take them a longer time to get to an extent of muscle loss where it starts to actually impact their health. So if we think about it, we start losing muscle technically from around our 30s. So most people in their late 20s, they're kind of at peak muscle size, muscle strength. And unfortunately, from your 30s onwards, it's pretty much all downhill from there for the majority of people. But as you said there, people who are more physically active, people who build muscle, who do all the things that they need to do to maintain their muscle over time, and hopefully we'll get into what those things are, they tend to hold onto their muscles for longer. They get to a higher peak level of muscle, and being at that higher peak level of muscle means that when they do lose muscle, it doesn't get so significant that it vastly impacts their health.
And is that impacted by what age you would start to exercise and live in a way that you would build muscle up? Because I feel like there's almost a bit of a generational thing. Certainly for me, and I'm early 40s, I just didn't exercise. until I got to about 30. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh God, maybe I should start looking after myself. And I do feel like there's a lot of people who do that. You go through your 20s, you eat what you want, you're out all the time, you're drinking, you're partying, you're not really focusing on longevity of life and really looking after yourself. And I think you get to a certain point in life where all of a sudden that becomes a bit more important. So does it matter at what point in life you start? Because you did mention late 20s is kind of peak for muscle.
Yeah, I know. It almost sounds like a scary statement when I say it like that.
Little bit.
Trying not to be too controversial with what I say. I think nobody would say it's controversial to say that the best time to start exercising or the best time to even start eating healthfully or taking care of your health is in your childhood.
Yeah.
But then the next best time would be today. Okay. So what I mean by that is, if somebody can look after their health, look after their muscle health, do all the things that they need to do to take care of that muscle health from childhood, they're going to get into a better state at their peak, at their prime.
Yeah.
And then they're going to lose that muscle mass a lot more gradually, a lot more slowly. But you can start now. So this is what a lot of my research deals with, is dealing with people who may not have been very physically active for their entire life, but we try to get them exercising more and doing more strength-based exercise, trying to get them to build muscle mass. And the fantastic thing is we can. Muscle is a wonderfully, what we call plastic tissue. It's something that can change very, very easily depending on what you do with it or the kind of stimulus that you give it. Mm-hmm. So we can see changes in people's muscle size, people's muscle strength, people's muscle health, even in their 70s or 80s.
And what effect does that losing muscle mass have on somebody's health?
So there's a lot. And I think one of the main ones, and it's one I like to kind of start with, is something that most people, regardless of their age, almost never think of, and it's frailty. And the reason I say people don't think of it is because when we're young and fit and healthy, we don't ever think of being particularly limited in what we can do at all. But when I talk about frailty, I talk about getting to a stage where you're not able to do just the normal activities of daily life. So it might be something as easy as, it might be something that's previously as easy as getting out of bed in the morning, mm-hmm. standing up from a chair, carrying your groceries home, picking up your grandchildren, putting something up into a high shelf in a cupboard. All of those things we take for absolute granted. Mm-hmm. But as people get older and as people lose some of that muscle, lose some of that strength, doing that becomes a lot more difficult. So frailty for me is like one of the biggest motivators that I have, because I don't ever want to get to a stage where I feel like I'm unable to do all the normal things that I can do.
Yeah.
But besides that, there's a lot of other things. So for example, we know that osteoporosis is very, very much associated with sarcopenia, with muscle loss. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons for that is when we move, our muscles are obviously attached to our bones, and they pull on our bones and they create this little stimulus that tells our bones to regenerate. Mm-hmm. And that's why if you look at studies that look at different athletes that do different sports and their level of bone density, some of the people with the greatest bone density are powerlifters, people who lift really, really heavy amounts of weight. Mm-hmm. And we know that people who have sarcopenia, they have a higher risk of having low bone density. And if they've got a higher risk of low bone density, they're also at a greater risk of fractures, mm-hmm. because, those bones are more likely to break because they're not as dense. And then kind of to add insult to injury, when we're older, we're also much more likely to suffer from falls. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason for that. So we've got a number of different types of muscle fiber in our body. We've got, let's say for kind of simplicity's sake, we've got type 1 and type 2. It's a lot more complicated than that. But type 1, classically, we'd think of them as the kind of muscles that do a lot of low strength, kind of long-term work. So things for like endurance activities. So if we're going for a long run, we're using our type 1 muscle fibers. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, we've got type 2, which are these fast twitch muscle fibers that produce a huge amount of power. And what they do is we use them for things like lifting weights, we use them for jumping, anything that requires a lot of power very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. And when we lose muscle over time, we know that we actually preferentially lose those type 2 fibers. We start to lose those first, and we lose those most significantly. And that means that if we ever need to do something that requires a lot of power in a very, very short amount of time, we lose that ability. Mm-hmm. And a classic example of that is when we slip. Because when we slip, we lose our balance. And our body's amazing. Our body's able to realize, oh crap, I'm falling. What am I going to do? And we start flailing our arms all over the place. And most of the time, we usually manage to right ourselves and stop ourselves from falling. Mm-hmm. But if we've got less of those type 2 muscle fibers, suddenly we can't do that. And that's why you hear about older people falling a lot more because they're not able to catch themselves. And if they're more likely to fall and they've got low bone density, they're also more likely to break a hip. And if they're more likely to break a hip or something like that, their risk of death in the next 12 months increases incredibly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So we've got, like I said, we've spoken about our bone density, we've spoken about frailty. On top of that, and kind of linked with the frailty aspect of things, is we've got an increase in cognitive decline. So we see that people who have lower levels of muscle mass seem to have greater risk of dementia as they get older. And we think that might just be down to people with more muscle mass are more physically active. And we know being physically active has a lot of links with brain health. And then the other one is depression. It seems that people with lower levels of muscle are also at a greater risk of depression. And we can probably assume that that's down to being frailer, not being able to do the things you used to be able to do, not to be able to do the things that you want to do, like socially, go out with friends, meet friends, get out of your house. And that can have a major impact on people's mental well-being. But besides that, and then kind of more focused on my research, we see a massive increase in risks of diabetes with people who have lower levels of muscle. And we see a really high risk of heart disease. And in fact, if we divide the population into different groups and we look at people with the lowest level of muscle and people with the highest level of muscle, in some studies, we've seen people with the highest level of muscle mass actually have an 80% lower risk of developing heart disease at all.
Wow. And so how does the muscle affect heart disease and diabetes risk?
Yeah, so there's a few different ways that it can have an effect. Some of them are more theoretical than others. I think one of the main ones is that muscle is what's called our main glucose sink in the body. So what that means is when we eat anything with carbohydrates, that carbohydrate gets digested and it gets turned into glucose. It goes into our bloodstream. And when we have a lot of glucose in our bloodstream, our body needs to get that glucose down to maintain a healthy glucose level. And it does that in a number of different ways. It secretes a hormone called insulin, and that sends glucose to different areas of the body for storage. And there are a number of different sites for storage. One of them is your fat tissue. And if you store a lot of glucose there, you're going to gain weight eventually. But another really, really important site of glucose disposal is our muscle, because we can actually store a huge amount of glucose within our muscle as a carbohydrate called glycogen. And the more muscle you have and the more physically active you are, it basically means the better you are at taking that glucose out of your blood and putting it into your muscle. And we say that people with higher levels of muscle are more insulin sensitive and more glucose sensitive, which means that they can dispose of that glucose really, really easily. And that puts them at a lower risk of diabetes. And that lower risk of diabetes is very, very intricately linked with heart disease, because we know that people with diabetes are at a much higher risk of heart disease as well as a number of other conditions. And then besides that, we've done research here at the university where we've shown that higher levels of muscle mass are associated with different levels of what we call blood lipids. So things like cholesterol and different types of cholesterol floating around in our body. And we've shown that higher levels of muscle are actually associated with what we call a less problematic lipid profile in the blood, which probably leads to a lower risk of heart disease long term.
And there's good cholesterol and bad cholesterol.
There is.
Isn't there?
There is, absolutely. It's a term that we, in let's say academia, we don't like to use all that often because it kind of oversimplifies things. I think one thing that people don't quite understand about cholesterol is that, so cholesterol is completely necessary. We need it. If we did not have cholesterol, we would not be alive. Simple as that. But if we have too much cholesterol of a particular form floating around in our blood for a long period of time, it can lead to a buildup in our arteries over time. And that's not good. So we need to control those cholesterol levels over time. And that's why there's lots and lots of different diets that are out there. For example, that there's the Mediterranean style diet, which has a genuine effect on reducing that amount of cholesterol floating around in our blood. And specifically, it helps to reduce the number of what we call carrier particles. So the number of little units that kind of transport that cholesterol around in our blood. And exercise also helps to reduce that number of transport particles, at least in some of the research that we've shown so far.
So it's not just a diet thing, cholesterol?
No, not at all. So diet is a major impact, don't get me wrong. And obviously, we're living in a world, what we call it an obesogenic environment, an environment where it's just super easy to gain extra weight.
Yeah, and cheap as well.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so much more expensive to buy the better option.
Absolutely. So like we talk about, or I think in social media, we hear about all of these different things that are leading to obesity and leading to people's weight gain. And we always want to put the blame on things like, oh, gluten is doing it, or people are, animal products are doing it. Or then if you look at like some of the more extreme factions, it's like all plant products are the ones that are causing all of the problems with obesity. The thing is, we just eat too much of everything. Yeah. And the reason for that is we live in a generation of ultra processed foods. So we've got foods that are, just like you said, incredibly cheap, available everywhere. We've never been in a situation where we've had so much food availability. It's just, nobody goes hungry, at least in most parts of the developed world. It's what we call hyper palatable, which means it's super delicious and it just makes us want to eat more and more and more of it. And it's incredibly easy to digest because it's usually been stripped of all of its fiber. It's been processed incredibly. So we eat it, we absorb pretty much all of it, and we just want to eat more and more and more and more.
But that's the problem, isn't it? Because those foods are designed to be like that, aren't they? And I remember somebody saying ages ago that the Pringles advertising campaign, once you pop, you can't stop. But if you actually look at the amount of calories in a whole tube of Pringles, it's outrageous. But people can quite easily sit there and just eat the whole lot themselves, can't they?
Oh, absolutely. But this is what food scientists are trained to do. They're trained to make foods that are absolutely delicious.
Yeah.
And they do it incredibly well. And yeah, like you'll see some foods that will have like a recommended serving size on it. And you usually see that recommended serving size after you've eaten the entire package.
Yeah,
and you're
exactly.
like, all right, I just had 5 serving sizes. Fantastic.
Well, I remember being shocked by, and I think most people probably would be, if you are calorie counting, the serving size for, I mean, I know cereal's not a great thing to be eating anyway, but the serving size for cereal is probably about a third of what most people would put in a bowl, isn't it?
Pretty much. So in my village back home in Ireland, we've got a local shop that produces their own muesli.
Yeah.
And I've had this, I have it anytime I go home. It's like crack. It's genuinely phenomenal. And we get it from the people who make it directly. So we don't even get it in a box, with the serving sizes on it. So we just get a bag of it. And I poured myself a bowl. And I just, out of curiosity, I said, okay, I'm just curious how much I poured out here.
In weight?
In weight. I just wanted to see. And like a serving size for muesli is generally anywhere from like 40 to 50 grams. Okay. I had poured out 140 grams of muesli into my bowl. And I was like, oh, right. That's why I gain weight every time I go back home to Ireland. And it was phenomenal. Like, don't get me wrong. It's like I still have it every time, but I'm a little bit more conscious of the amount I'm eating.
Well, yeah, because I think visually, I know other brands make them, but the Kellogg's individual packets, which you would consider to be a child's portion, that's a serving size. Yep. That's how much you are, when you're looking at the calories on something, that's how much they think that you're eating, but nobody is.
Yeah, and I admit, even as a child, I thought they were tiny portions.
They are tiny portions. So getting back to muscle, what can people do to look after their muscle health as they get older?
Well, I think the number one thing, and most people are going to kind of like just roll their eyes when I say this because nobody wants to hear it, is exercise. Exercise is, and I'm saying that as a nutritionist by training. So like my entire kind of career up to my PhD was all food based. But I can happily say that without a doubt, the number one thing you can do to look after your muscle health as you get older is to be more active. But specifically, strengthening exercises. So strength-based exercises are one of the best things that you can do to build muscle and to build strength. Because we also know that, I mentioned muscle size a lot, but we see that the loss of muscle strength is actually even more strongly associated with all of those conditions that I mentioned earlier. And that's usually down to just knowing that muscle strength is a very, very good proxy for muscle quality. And strengthening exercises are really good because they improve muscle strength considerably and they improve muscle size. They make muscle more metabolically healthy, more metabolically active. It gets better at controlling our blood sugar. Bigger muscles are able to store more blood glucose. Healthier muscles, which are more active, are able to store more blood glucose, look after our blood sugar levels, and then have all of these positive effects potentially on cholesterol levels and other blood lipids, like I mentioned a little bit down the line. So exercise, without a shadow of doubt, is the number one thing. And a lot of people are kind of, when I say strengthening exercise, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things like, so for example, if you do no exercise at the moment, a strengthening exercise can be walking up and down the stairs every day. And we have research that shows that, like, it was done in an older group of women over in Canada, and they were inactive. They had really low step counts. All they did was start a walking routine every day, and they were able to improve their muscle size just doing that. So I say start at whatever your level is. And it might be just walking up and down the stairs. It might be doing some body weight exercises, things like push-ups at home. It might be using resistance bands, graduating to that. And the idea is to, as you can, progress onto a kind of a higher level. Get onto some free weights, get onto machines, start challenging your muscle, because that's what your muscle wants to stimulate its growth, is that challenge that comes from these different exercises. So resistance exercise, if you can do it 1 day a week and you're doing nothing right now, fantastic. If you can move up to 2 days a week, that'd be brilliant. 3, even better. 4, even better as well. And then besides that, we've got the other major stimulus of muscle growth, which is protein. And so we hear about protein all the time nowadays because of it's just everywhere. Every product seems to have a protein version now. Like, you know, I can get my Snickers as a protein version and feel, you know, slightly happier about myself for doing it. But protein also stimulates muscle growth, not as much as exercise. Exercise is what we call like the key. If you don't have exercise, you can eat all the protein in the world and you're not going to put on muscle. And like, again, research that we've done here at the university at John Moores has shown that, you know, you need that exercise stimulus. But when you've got that exercise stimulus and you add protein on top of that, you get an even better effect at increasing muscle mass. So we advise people to get more protein into their diet. But older people, and this is kind of part of the whole sarcopenia problem, don't react to protein as well as younger people. So they actually need to eat more.
Okay.
And when we say more, we say like about 40 grams of protein per serving. And
what would that equate to? So say you've got a chicken breast, an average size chicken breast that you've bought from a supermarket. How much protein would that be roughly in grams?
So if you get a big chicken breast, you could get about 40 grams of protein out of that, no problem whatsoever. But the problem is if you look at the diet in the UK, people generally don't eat that much protein in general. So if you look at it, actually, breakfast is around 12 grams of protein. Lunch is usually about 20 grams of protein. And then dinner is usually the highest protein meal because dinner is usually the biggest meal of the day in the UK. That's about 40 grams. So we've got to look at those meals that are low in protein at the moment. And breakfast, what can we do to that? And one thing I say to people is, I think some of these protein products are phenomenal. So for example, there are protein yogurts or protein puddings that people can eat. And they've got like a full 25 gram portion of protein in one single serving. And because it's a yogurt, it's not kind of this weird, like, it's not like giving somebody a protein shake. And like, can you imagine your granny having a protein shake? Like, you know, because I can't at all. So like, if you give somebody a protein yogurt, it's much more familiar. I've had yogurt before. It's just a protein yogurt. You have that. Some people do take protein shakes. They can have that. Or you can try and increase the amount of food with protein. But one issue with that is, one, protein is a very expensive macronutrient. If you think of like the cost of meat, it's quite expensive. Dairy, on the other hand, is a little bit cheaper. And then protein is also a very satiating nutrient. It fills us up. And the problem with a lot of older people is that their appetite tends to decline as they get older as well. So you need to find ways to work around this. But aiming for that 40 grams of protein, whatever way you do it, and getting like 3 meals a day with that, as well as getting lots of resistance exercise during the week, is, if you can do those two things, you are doing better than 98% of the population. You know, there's a couple of other little things that you can do in terms of like supplements. For example, long chain fatty acids that we get from fish oils, they might have an effect on helping to improve muscle mass. Getting enough vitamin D, if somebody's vitamin D deficient, can be really useful as well. And then another supplement that some people may have heard of is something called creatine, which is very common in bodybuilding circles. And a lot of older people, you know, don't necessarily think of it as something they can take. But we've seen massive improvements in muscle function and in muscle size in older people taking creatine. And another one of the perks of taking creatine is that a lot of people don't realize this, but after our muscle, one of the main uses of creatine is in our brain. And creatine can actually help to improve brain function in older people as well. So it makes people a little bit more cognitively sharp. It improves short-term memory. It improves their ability to do certain cognitive tasks. So it's kind of, you've got a double whammy of effects there.
With your background in nutrition though, I would be interested, you mentioned like the protein Snickers. What are your thoughts on how things are being marketed at the minute? Because you're right, you go to the supermarket and you see protein everything. And I think is it easy for people to fall into a trap of going, oh, it says protein, it's healthy? Because obviously you need to watch your sugars with that, don't you? Because yes, you could have a protein Snickers, but probably having 2 protein Snickers for dessert every day isn't going to end well, is it?
Yeah. And this is, again, marketing. It's the health halo. You give something a healthy title and everybody's like, oh, I can have as much of that as I want. And while I think that there is definitely scope for a lot of these products, and I personally, I'm very grateful for a lot of these protein yogurts and these kind of protein desserts that we see popping up in the market, because they are quite useful, especially for older people. At the university, and I think most nutritionists would say this, we're very much a food first. We like to use a food first approach. And what that means is try and take care of your nutritional needs by just focusing on real foods first, but not food only. And what that means is sometimes you realize, okay, I can improve my diet by supplementing. And supplementing is just that. You're adding something into your diet. You're not making your entire diet based on the supplement. Yeah. Right. And I have quite a selection of protein bars in my house, and that's just because I like to get a protein bar every now and then. And instead of having a regular chocolate bar, I'll have a protein bar instead. Yeah. Maybe it just helps me quell a craving or something like that. I don't think there's anything wrong with them. I think they can be abused if somebody's just making their diet based off protein bars. Yeah. But yeah, food first, but not food only.
And in terms of the protein to stop this muscle mass decline, how much more difficult is that for someone who is vegetarian or vegan? Because a lot of it does come from meat and dairy, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it does get a little bit more difficult, but it's by no means impossible. So one of the things that I would say is that while vegetarians do tend to eat less protein than omnivores, so people who eat, a bit of everything, another issue besides that quantity of protein that they eat is the quality of protein. So vegetarian protein sources tend to be of a slightly lower quality, and that's not necessarily a major problem. What I mean by a lower quality is protein is made up of things called amino acids, and we need to have all of these amino acids in the right amounts to help us with muscle growth and all of the other functions in our body. Meat, dairy, eggs, they usually have a really, really good mix of all of those amino acids. Plant proteins, on the other hand, so things like beans, they tend to be a little bit deficient in some amino acids. Okay. The only thing that means is we need to eat more of them. Okay. And we have plenty of research that shows that if you eat enough of plant protein, you can actually get just as good effect at stimulating muscle growth as a whey protein, which is the best protein in the world, and that comes from milk. So for example, if you are aiming for that 40 grams of protein and you're getting that through plant-based proteins, absolutely fine.
And in terms of the muscle, what research are you doing in this field here at LJMU?
So we're currently doing a study which is called the Primer trial. And what we're doing is we're working with people in cardiac rehab. So these are people who've already had a heart attack, for example. And cardiac rehab is a service that's offered through the NHS usually, sometimes it's private. And it's usually an exercise-focused intervention where people are basically put into a gym and they do a lot of aerobic exercise. So they hop onto bikes and treadmills and stuff like that to build up their aerobic capacity, because we know that that is a fantastic way of reducing your future risk of heart disease. We wanted to see if we could do something a little bit different. So we wanted to see, what if we focused on muscle size and strength instead of focusing just on the aerobic side of things? And what if we put a focus on the diet as well? Could that lead to better improvements in cardiac rehab? So we designed a program, and what we have is a number of people who are doing a strength training program that we've designed. They're doing it 3 days a week at our research centers out in Knowsley. And we also have them doing a special diet that we've devised, which is a high protein diet, but it's a high protein Mediterranean style diet. And the reason we're using a Mediterranean style diet is because there's a huge amount of evidence that shows that it has major benefits for heart disease in particular, but a load of other chronic diseases like diabetes. It helps to reduce the risk of something called metabolic syndrome, improves cognitive health. And we're currently at the end of this. Let's say we've been doing this intervention for 2 years. We've got our last participant coming in January, as far as I know, for their final visit. And we'll be able to analyze all of that data, hopefully at the start of next year. And we'll be able to see, what effect does this have compared to normal cardiac rehab. But basically, we want to see, can we increase muscle mass and strength? Can we make people stronger, make them a little bit more muscular? We're not turning anybody into Arnold Schwarzenegger by any.
Well, I was going to say this because people who aren't familiar with exercise or don't incorporate it into their lives at the minute might hear muscle size and think, Love Island, I'm never going to look like that. It's not for me. No, walk away.
Yeah. So when I do presentations on this, I will put a picture of a bodybuilder onto which I've photoshopped an OAP's face. But we're not turning anybody into that at all. When we say increase muscle size, we're just talking about building a little bit of muscle and strength. We are not making bodybuilders by any means. And we had some people who had a little bit concerns about doing that, about, building muscle, like people who are in our cardiac rehab program. But I had ladies at the end of their 12-week intervention, they came up to me and one of them told me, said, I've started wearing tank tops, sleeveless tops for the first time ever, because I'm really proud of my guns. And those were her words exactly. And we've had a lot of people come back to us just saying about how confident they feel now. Yeah. Like people carrying cases, like say, I would never have tried carrying that before, but I feel much more confident to do it now. So in terms of quality of life, the results have been absolutely phenomenal. And we can't wait to look at the blood work to see how that's changed as well.
And I think another thing, when you talk about lifting weights or going to the gym, I think a lot of women especially think, oh God, it's going to make me big. It's going to make me bulky. That's not what I want. And it doesn't, does it?
No, not at all. Like I think anybody who lifts weights, and I will put in a caveat, anybody who lifts weights and isn't taking steroids, right, and has been lifting for absolute years, they don't look like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
No.
Okay, right? And I've been lifting weights for years and I feel forever small. Like they say the first time you step in the gym is the first day you'll feel forever small. I haven't turned into Arnold Schwarzenegger, and I don't think a 12-week strength training program is going to turn any of my participants into, genetic freaks or something like that.
So for somebody listening now, what do you want to leave people with? What are the most important things to focus on?
I think it's quite simple. Just look after your muscle health, and to do that, just be active. Be active daily if you can, and include some strength training into your routine, and find a way to enjoy it. Because one thing that a lot of people in the program said to me is that they had no interest in strength training at all. And then after 12 weeks, just because of the way that we set things up, we gamified it. We made it easy for them to progress, and they constantly wanted to kind of beat what they did the previous week. Find a way to enjoy it, and it doesn't become a chore. It becomes something that you enjoy doing, and you go to the gym. It's like, oh yes, I get to go to the gym today. I'm really looking forward to it. And eat a little bit more protein. And that's about it.
Brilliant, Richie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Mindful Merseyside, brought to you by the Institute for Health Research at Liverpool John Moores University and produced by Inabella Media. We hope you found the conversation informative and insightful. If you or someone you know has been affected by any of the issues discussed in this episode, please refer to the help and resources listed in the show notes for details of organisations that can provide support. I've been your host, Gemma Cutting, and don't forget to subscribe to Mindful Merseyside wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and I hope you'll join us again soon.